Have you ever been compared to an animal by your own child? I have. I remember the scene exactly. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, as I had for decades. It was a normal morning, or at least it should have been. The kettle was starting to whistle, and I was stirring the sugar in his cup. That automatic gesture only a mother or a grandmother performs, even when she receives nothing in return. It was then that he walked in, with that impatient look, and uttered the phrase that echoes in my head to this day: "Grandma barks too much." He laughed as if it were just a joke. But inside me, something I can't name broke. Have you ever been there? That moment when the person you love most turns you into something lesser, something unimportant. In that instant, I was no longer a mother, nor a grandmother, nor a woman. I was just a nuisance in the house, a tolerated presence, like an old piece of furniture no one has the courage to throw away. And worst of all, he said this in front of the dog, as if he were lowering me to the level of an animal, perhaps even below it. Buddy, the dog, was lying on the couch. He lifted his head at the sound of Jake's laughter and wagged his tail, as if understanding that, in that silent hierarchy that was forming there, he had more place than I did. Mother replaced by dog. Grandmother humiliated by her own son. Does that sound exaggerated? Well, it's the absolute truth, and as I slowly stirred the spoon in my cup, I felt the bitter taste of loneliness in old age. Over the years, I've always heard stories of ungrateful children, abandoned elderly people, forgotten mothers, but deep down, I thought it would be different with me. After all, I gave him everything, every piece of me, every sleepless night, every penny I could save. You'll understand how I realized it in time to protect myself, but in that moment, I just stood there, still, pretending I didn't hear, pretending that sentence hadn't pierced my skin like a knife. Stay with me until the end, because this story isn't just about pain. It's about the law of return in families. It's about when divine justice meets those who believe they will always have control over those who have already sacrificed too much. It's about how silence can be stronger than any scream. What hurt me most wasn't the sentence. It was the look, that look of someone who believes you won't react, that you'll accept anything just to stay close, as if my life were a worthless scrap of time, as if I'd forgotten that a mother, a grandmother, is still a person. As I sat at the table, watching the steam rise from the cup, a strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't just sadness, it was something deeper. An emptiness mixed with a strength I didn't remember possessing. Something was about to change, and I knew that from that day forward, I would never be the same. And it was in this silence that I began to plan. I didn't yet know exactly what I would do, but I felt, deep down, that this humiliation couldn't go unnoticed. I needed to find a way to show that my voice still existed, that I wasn't just an annoying sound in the back of the house. If anything in this story has upset you, leave a comment below to tell me what bothered you most. I'd love to hear if you've ever experienced something similar, or if you know someone who has. Reading your feelings and thoughts makes me realize I'm not alone, and that, somehow, our stories intertwine. And if you feel like this story needs to reach more people, like the video. It may seem small, but every like lets YouTube know it's worth sharing this content with more people who might need to hear it right now. If you want to continue following real stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription keeps this community alive and ensures that our voice, the voice of those often ignored, continues to resonate and reach places where it needs to be heard. Your participation is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. As I stared out the window that morning, the sun was beginning to shine into the backyard, but the light inside me still hadn't returned. I knew that to get it back, I had to take the next step. I'm Ellen, 72 years old. When I was widowed, the house seemed too big for so much silence, and my son insisted I move in with him. He said it would be easier for everyone, that I could help with my grandson, and at the same time, I wouldn't be alone. At first, it seemed like a good decision. I would wake up early, make coffee, tidy the kitchen before they woke up, wash the clothes carefully, sorting each item as if it were a small gesture of affection. All of this gave me a sense of purpose, as if, somehow, I still had an important role in this family. But over time, I realized my place in that house wasn't as solid as I'd imagined. Small signs began to emerge. The conversation at the table dwindled. The laughter that once included me now happened behind closed doors. I'd cook dinner, and it would often go untouched, as if the effort I'd put in had been worthless. It's strange when you realize that the presence that was once expected becomes merely tolerated. Still, I pressed on. The mindset I'd carried my entire life was to serve, to remain useful. I believed love was shown in actions, and that, deep down, they knew it. But the hidden truth is that people don't always see what's right in front of their eyes. There's a silent transformation in the way they treat us, and it's almost never announced. Taking care of my grandson was my joy. I took him to school, helped with his homework, and made up bedtime stories. But little by little, I realized that even in this regard, my place was shrinking. His mother said she didn't want me to get too tired, and so, one day at a time, I was removed from these small routines that gave me meaning. It was like watching my own importance slowly being erased. The feeling was like sweeping the yard on a windy day. No matter how hard you try, the leaves bounce back, and in the end, no one even realizes you tried. Deep down, what hurt me most wasn't the lack of recognition, but the coldness that began to set in. My son's gaze no longer held the same warmth, and as much as I tried to ignore it, I knew a distance was growing between us. Then Buddy appeared, a soft-furred dog with a shrewd look. At first, I thought it would be nice to have a pet in the house. I'd always loved dogs, and I imagined he'd bring more joy to everyone. But I soon realized that this little creature was taking up not only space on the couch, but also the affection that previously, albeit restrained, was still mine. Phrases like "Buddy understands better than people" or "he doesn't complain about anything" began to appear. And each one was like a reminder that, in that house, I was no longer a priority. It wasn't overnight. But this emotional replacement left deep scars. It was more than being traded for a dog. It was the realization that my presence could be dispensable. Silent loneliness took hold, even surrounded by walls teeming with life. I spent hours staring out the window, observing the hustle and bustle of the street, as if there were a world out there that still saw me. At these times, the mind begins to create dialogues, revisit decisions, and question what could have been done differently. But it wasn't regret. It was an internal process, almost a backstage of emotions, where each good memory was mixed with the bitter impact of the current reality. And, little by little, I began to understand that the change that was coming wouldn't just be in the house, but within me, if you understood exactly what I'm saying. Right, I see you in the comments. At first, I tried to believe it was just a phase, that Buddy's arrival had changed the household routine, and that, in time, everything would return to normal. But the days passed, and the distance between me and my own son only grew. Jake began to talk to me less, and when I tried to start a conversation, I got that dry response, sometimes without even looking up, until one day, in the middle of a small talk about dinner, he interrupted me. "Buddy doesn't like noise." What he really meant was that he didn't like to hear me. This was one of those sentences that doesn't seem so serious to outsiders, but leaves a deep mark on the recipient. It was as if my presence were uncomfortable, as if every word I said had to be measured so as not to disturb a dog's comfort. And it wasn't about Buddy. Never had anything against him. It was about the priority I had lost. From that moment on, I noticed small exclusions that, combined, became a wall between us. Dinners without my being invited, whispered conversations behind closed doors, family outings that suddenly no longer included my name. It felt like I was watching my own life unfold from outside a window. I was inside the house, but outside of everything that mattered. In the silence of my room, I began to realize it wasn't just rejection. It was a transformation in how he saw me and, perhaps, how I saw myself, too. I began to question all the decisions that had brought me to that point. The hidden truth, the one we avoid facing, is that we often give everything, hoping it will guarantee us eternal love. But love doesn't work like a bank account. It needs to be nurtured every day, and when that doesn't happen, the account drains faster than we imagine. My routine became one of long silences and automatic gestures. I still did the laundry, cooked, and tidied up what I could, but there was no longer any joy in these gestures. It was as if I were living behind the scenes of my own story, erased from the main scenes. And the more I observed, the more I realized that what hurt wasn't just the lack of attention, but the disrespect disguised as indifference. I tried to maintain my dignity, but inside me, a silent anger grew. It wasn't the anger of someone who wants to scream or fight. It was that deep anger that builds when you realize you've been diminished so many times that you've somehow begun to believe you deserve this lesser place. The injustice wasn't just in what he said or did, but in the fact that I had allowed my importance to be diminished. It was in this state that I began to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed. The way he leaned in to pet Buddy, how his eyes lit up when he saw the dog come running. While with me, his gaze was quick, almost impersonal. The impact of this was overwhelming, because it wasn't about jealousy, but rather the realization that the affection that had once been mine was now completely directed toward another being, and that I no longer had a place in that space of love. I didn't yet know what the next step would be, but something inside me was beginning to shift. The mindset of accepting any scrap of attention was dissolving, and in its place was born a new, still fragile, but growing force. Part of me wanted to protect myself, another wanted to be seen again, and deep down, I knew that if nothing was done, that cycle of exclusion and silence would erase me forever. If you understand that feeling of being left out, right, I'm still here in the comments. That night, everything felt heavier. I had grown accustomed to short answers, lingering glances, and even veiled jokes. But what happened that day wasn't just another small blow, it was the final straw. I was in the hallway, heading to the kitchen for a glass of water, when he approached the door, looked at me expressionlessly and said, "Go to sleep, Grandma." Then he locked the door behind him. It was simple, quick, but the impact was like a sharp knife. It wasn't just about sending me to my room. It was about taking away my right to exist in common spaces, to participate, to be present. I stood there for a few minutes, staring at that closed door, listening to the muffled sound of laughter on the other side. And that was when something changed. Until then, I had accepted rejection as an inevitable burden, as if my role was simply to endure it. But in that moment, a silent decision was born within me. I was going to disappear. Not as an impulsive act, but as a calculated, considered move. I wanted to see the impact my absence would have. I wanted to understand, and make him understand, who was truly the burden in whose life. It was strange, because along with the pain came a new calm. The mindset that had previously kept me trapped, waiting for attention, began to shift. I stopped thinking about what I could do to be accepted and started thinking about what I could do to free myself. And this liberation didn't mean yelling, confrontation, or trying to convince. It meant acting silently, like someone preparing a board before moving the decisive piece. Over the next few days, I began to observe everything with new eyes. I noticed patterns, noting the times he left, the moments Buddy was alone, the details of what was in the pantry. It was like being backstage at a show. I was experiencing myself, but of which, until then, I hadn't noticed every movement. The hidden truth is that when you stop seeking approval, you begin to see clearly. I went about my tasks as usual, but inside, planning was underway. Small decisions began to take shape. Where would I go? What would I bring? How could I make sure he felt the impact of my absence? I didn't want to disappear forever, but I wanted him to experience, even if only for a day, the emptiness I'd been feeling for years. There was a certain quiet pleasure in the thought of this exit. It wasn't pure revenge, more a matter of emotional justice. I'd been pushed aside so many times that now I wanted him to feel what it was like to have something important, or someone important, torn from my everyday life. The transformation taking place within me was so profound that even the way I walked around the house changed. I no longer slouched. My steps were firmer, even if he didn't notice. I began leaving little clues about my estrangement. A purse that disappeared for a few hours, an absence during coffee, a longer than usual silence. It was like laying the groundwork for a revelation. This journey wasn't just about leaving home, but about reclaiming my own voice. Even if I didn't say a single word. At night, lying in bed, I thought about the exact moment he would notice. I imagined the sound of his footsteps through the house, calling for me, looking into every room and finding only the echo of his own neglect. This image gave me strength. I knew that when the time came, there would be no shouting or accusations, only silence, the same silence he had imposed on me, but now returned with a much greater weight. If you've ever had a moment where you decided to change everything without saying a word, write "it was my limit" in the comments. The early morning, I decided to put my plan into action, began like any other. The distant sound of the television in the living room, the insistent ticking of the kitchen clock, and Buddy sleeping curled up on the rug. I moved slowly, unhurriedly, as if knowing each step must be calculated. There was no anger in my gesture, only a calm certainty. I had already prepared everything the previous days. Clothes discreetly folded inside a small bag, documents tucked away in the back of a drawer, a little cash wrapped in an old handkerchief. Nothing exaggerated, just what was necessary to leave, without leaving an immediate trace. As I walked down the hallway, I realized how much that house had transformed for me. Every wall, every piece of furniture, every object seemed to carry a different weight now. They were no longer memories, good or bad, but simply marks of a place where I had become invisible. This hidden truth, that we can disappear long before we truly leave, was perhaps what hurt me most throughout this journey. I walked through the kitchen and filled Buddy's bowl with food and water. I stroked his head for a few seconds. He looked at me with those innocent eyes, not understanding that, come dawn, I would no longer be there. And it was in that moment that I felt a strange mix of liberation and farewell. Leaving him behind was part of the impact I wanted to make. It wasn't his fault, but I knew my absence would be felt through him. My room was tidy as if nothing had happened. The bed was made, the curtains slightly open to let in a beam of streetlight. The emptiness wouldn't be noticed at first glance, and that was the intention. Jake would have to walk, search, call out until he understood. This was the revelation I wanted to provoke. Silence not as weakness, but as a message. As I walked through the door, I felt the cool early morning air. It was different to breathe outside that house without having to return a few minutes later. It was as if I were opening not only the door, but also a new chapter in my own story. I didn't know exactly what would come next, but I was clear that there would be no going back to the same old mindset. As I walked away, I could imagine the scene that would unfold hours later. Jake waking up, calling my name throughout the house, perhaps not urgently at first. The sound of the dog barking, the quickening footsteps, the weight of silence filling every room. The absence that would suddenly become the protagonist. This decision wasn't spur of the moment. It was built in layers, day after day, like a play rehearsed backstage until the right moment to step on stage. And in that moment, I was the sole author of my departure. The sense of control over my own narrative was something I hadn't felt in years. I didn't leave a note, because any written word could soften the blow, and I didn't want to soften it. I wanted the absence to speak for itself. It was a silence full of meaning, laden with everything I hadn't said. All the conversations he hadn't wanted to hear, all the times I'd been interrupted. I walked a few more blocks, feeling the cold on my face and the warmth of a shy freedom beginning to grow. I knew that wherever I was when day broke, the message would already be delivered, and somehow, that was enough for me. The transformation that had begun in the hallway, in front of that locked door, was now taking shape on the empty street before me. If you've ever felt the weight of a silence that said more than any words, write silence, speaks in the comments. The dawn of that day brought a different silence. It was no longer the heavy silence I carried inside, but an external, living silence that began to spread to every corner of the house. I was no longer there to muffle the sound with pots on the stove or the shuffling of my footsteps down the hallway. All that remained was the sound of Buddy, restless, pacing back and forth, as if sensing something wasn't right. I can picture the exact moment Jake realized. Perhaps it was when he opened my bedroom door and found the bed made, the closet partially empty, and the air still, nothing out of place, but everything absent. It's curious how absence can have more impact than any loud presence. And it was this calculated absence that began to erode his routine. At first, he must have thought I'd gone for a walk, as I did occasionally, but as the hours passed, the discomfort grew. The phone didn't ring, there was no note, no message. He began searching for me around the house, opening doors, calling my name, but receiving only the echo of his own call in response. It was the first time in a long time that he felt the real weight of wanting me around, not out of convenience, but out of necessity. From then on, I imagined the anxiety mounting, Buddy barking louder, pacing back and forth as if trying to explain something. Jake, already out of patience, picking up his cell phone, perhaps calling some acquaintances, and always receiving the same answer: no one knew about me. The hidden truth is that the mind of someone who has always felt in control doesn't handle the unexpected well. And, at that moment, he was getting a taste of his own medicine. When he knocked on the neighbor's door, it was a different version of him, not the confident man who speaks loudly and laughs at his own jokes. It was a restless man, his voice lower, asking, "Have you seen my mother?" The scene must have been almost ironic to the onlooker. The same hands that had so often pointed at me to be quiet were now knocking from door to door, looking for me. It was the law of return, acting unhurriedly, at just the right time for the lesson to be felt. The neighborhood, of course, began to talk. Curtains moved, whispers grew louder. It was as if my disappearance had created a small spectacle in the neighborhood. People who previously hadn't even remembered I lived there were now wondering where I was. And, for me, there was something deeply revealing about that. You have to disappear for some to realize you were there all along. As he searched for answers, the image of him standing there at his neighbor's door, probably tired and unsure of where to go, became a symbol of inversion. For me, the role had changed. Before, I was the one waiting, the one staring out the window, the one awaiting a gesture from him. Now, he was the one waiting for me. And this transformation, even if temporary, carried a weight that no amount of conversation could generate. The journey that began as a silent act was becoming a mirror for him. Each step he took in search of me was a step into a maze created by his own choices. And I knew this search wasn't just geographic, it was emotional. He was trying to find something that, perhaps, had been lost for much longer than he realized. If you believe that sometimes you have to step back to be truly seen, right? This is how they learn, in the comments. As I think about that scene of him standing in front of his neighbor's door, a strange mix of feelings comes over me. It wasn't exactly satisfaction, but a silent confirmation that certain lessons only come when life holds up a mirror. And in that moment, he was seeing a reflection he hadn't expected. If anything in this story has upset you, leave a comment below about what bothered you most. I'd love to hear if you've ever experienced something similar or witnessed a situation that triggered this same sense of injustice. It's in each person's stories that we realize how often these experiences recur and how important it is to talk about them. If you think this message needs to reach more people, please like the video. It seems like a small gesture, but each like helps YouTube show this content to others who may be going through something similar right now. And if you want to continue following real stories that move us and make us think about how we treat and are treated, subscribe to the channel. It's your participation that keeps this community alive and ensures that voices like mine, and perhaps yours, continue to be heard. And as he went from door to door, trying to piece together pieces that didn't fit, I knew what came next would be even more revealing. 2 days had passed since I closed that door behind me. 2 days of walking streets, making connections, knocking on doors. 2 days in which, for the first time in a long time, Jake tasted the bitter taste of absence. I knew that by now, the silence had turned to unease, and the unease into something deeper, longing. Not the comfortable longing of someone who remembers good times, but the aching longing of someone who fears they've lost something forever. He didn't find me at a relative's house, or in the neighborhood. There was no note, no clue, no message, just an emptiness that spread throughout where I had been. And it was this unanswered search that eventually led him to the church where, for years, I had made silent donations. A simple, unpretentious place, but it had always been my refuge. It was there that I sat to organize my thoughts, to find meaning when life seemed too small for so much pain. When he entered, he saw me sitting on the right-hand bench, my hands resting in my lap, my gaze fixed on the altar. I didn't stand, not out of pride, but because at that moment, my peace was more important than any impulse. He stood still for a few seconds, as if unsure where to begin. Then, without saying anything, he knelt beside me. It wasn't the posture of a man who had come to argue or demand. It was the gesture of someone who had finally remembered who stood before him. And in that instant, like a silent film, my mind took me back to so many moments he'd probably already forgotten. I saw myself caring for him when the fever left him, weak, sitting on the edge of his bed, changing cold towels on his forehead. I remembered when he was little and I, in the rain, would carry him in my arms to protect him, ignoring the cold biting my skin. I remembered the nights I stayed awake so he could sleep peacefully, listening only to his breathing. These flashbacks came not with resentment, but with the realization that a mother's love, even wounded, is woven from memories that never fade. He didn't say much, but what he did say carried a weight I recognized. His words were short, hesitant, like someone trying to get closer, unsure if they'll be accepted. I listened, and each pause seemed more revealing than any sentence. It was as if, in that church pew, there were not just two bodies, but two distinct journeys that, for an instant, met again. The transformation I wanted to bring about was already happening. Not because he knelt, but because, for the first time, he saw me as someone essential. And this new mindset of his, even if temporary, showed that sometimes you have to push yourself to the limit to see the value of what was always there. I knew that, from then on, the decisions we would make would be different. He because he saw what real loss means, and I because I learned that, to be heard, sometimes you have to be silent first. There was still much to be said, wounds to be faced, and hidden truths to be revealed. But in that moment, the silence that enveloped us already carried more meaning than any speech. It was the kind of moment that transforms not only the relationship, but also our very perception of who we are and what we accept. If you believe that sometimes silence can be more powerful than any words, write silence teaches in the comments. He took a while to find the words. His eyes were red, his breathing heavy, as if the simple act of speaking required more strength than he had. When he finally opened his mouth, his voice was choked. "Forgive me, Mom. I thought it was just a joke." The sentence hung in the air, as if waiting for me to finish it, for me to give him the immediate absolution I'd offered so many times in the past. But I said nothing. I remained looking at him, not with anger, but with the dignity of someone who knows exactly the value of their own pain. What he perhaps didn't understand at the time was that some wounds can't be healed with words alone. It wasn't about pride or revenge. It was about the hidden truth he never wanted to face, that a mother's love isn't inherently unbreakable, but strengthened or destroyed by the decisions you make every day. The impact of what he said and did wasn't an isolated incident. It was the sum total of repeated gestures, cold looks, jokes disguised as affection. As he spoke, Buddy lay in his lap, quiet, as if he too sensed something important was happening. It was a strange, almost symbolic scene. The dog, who, for so long, had represented my replacement, now stood between us, like an unlikely bridge. The journey to this point had been hard, filled with silence and distance, but it was also in this empty space that I found the strength to reposition myself. Jake tried to justify it, saying he never imagined his words could hurt me like that. But I knew, and he knew, too deep down, that the mentality of playing with another's pain always leaves scars. He began to remember old times when I'd protected him as a child, and his voice trembled more with each memory. It was as if, by revisiting the past, he finally understood the extent of what he'd risked. I listened attentively, but not to decide in that instant whether to forgive him or not. I listened to register, within myself, that this moment was different. It was no longer the conversation of a mother who shrinks from an offense to preserve the peace. It was the dialogue of someone who knew that, for any reconciliation to be true, it would need to be born of deep and sincere recognition. Deep down, I realized it wasn't just about asking for forgiveness. It was about seeing my son, finally, vulnerable. For the first time in a long time, he was willing to admit he'd made a mistake and that it had consequences. This belated revelation didn't erase the past, but it might, perhaps, pave the way for a different future. Still, I didn't rush. Some answers need to mature in silence, and I wanted him to feel the weight of that time. The church pew, cold under my hands, reminded me that I was there by choice, that I had decided to step away to reclaim my own voice. And now, standing before him, I saw confirmation that this decision had been necessary. The separation had served not only for him to seek me, but for him to seek himself as well. And perhaps, in this dual search, something new could be born. If you've ever heard an apology that came too late, right time goes on forever in the comments. Returning home wasn't an act of surrender, but of redefinition. I knew that if I walked through that door again, it couldn't be to occupy the same silent role I'd accepted. I didn't return as someone returning to a place of comfort, but as someone establishing a new territory, even if that territory was the very space where I'd once lived. Before entering, I took a deep breath, as if to leave behind everything that had reduced me. It was an invisible line. Crossing it meant there were now clear rules. The first and most important of these was simple. I would be heard, not just politely listened to, but truly heard, with attention, respect, and presence. I said this calmly, without raising my voice. I spoke as if I no longer needed to convince, only to inform. The mindset that had brought me there had changed profoundly. I was no longer willing to accept emotional crumbs in exchange for a roof over my head or a false sense of belonging. Jake listened in silence. She didn't look away, and perhaps that was the first sign that he understood, or at least, that he knew he wasn't dealing with the same mother he'd let go without asking where she was going. I didn't mention the past in that conversation. I didn't need to. It was implicit in every word, in the weight of every pause. I made it clear that if I ever felt the indifference that had made me leave again, I would get up and leave for good, without warning, without turning back. In the days that followed, the house felt different, though physically it remained the same. The atmosphere changed. The silence, which had previously been synonymous with distance, was now comfortable, as if everyone had found a more respectful rhythm. Buddy, always nearby, would lie at my feet while I drank tea with my neighbor. On the porch, life hadn't turned into a fairy tale, but the balance was there, albeit fragile. Talking with my neighbor those afternoons became a ritual. We talked about simple things, plants, recipes, old stories. She knew part of my journey and could read in my eyes what words couldn't say. Those encounters reminded me that my life had more layers than just being a mother. There was a whole woman there, with memories, skills, desires, and decisions of her own. This rediscovery of myself was, perhaps, the greatest gain of this transformation. Jake gradually began to include my name in conversations again, asking my opinion on trivial matters, treating me as an active part of the household. I could tell he was trying, but I also knew there was still a lot to adjust. Respect isn't cemented in days. It's built behind the scenes, in the daily details, in the care not to repeat old patterns, and I was attentive to each of these signs. This new phase was also a test for me. I needed to be vigilant so as not to nullify myself again, so as not to allow habit to lead me back to a place of invisibility. Maintaining my restored dignity required constant presence, not in the physical sense, but in the emotional. It was about being aware of my own boundaries and defending them firmly. It wasn't about creating a perfect relationship, but about ensuring that the hidden truth that my worth doesn't depend on his approval remained visible for both of us. This mindset gave me security. I knew that if at any point I felt the balance tipping back toward devaluation, I would have the strength to act. If you've ever had to return to a place, but with new rules to protect who you are, right? I came back to friend in the comments. There are things we only understand when it's too late. It's not about the magnitude of the mistake, but about the amount of time allowed to pass before attempting to correct it. I've always believed that life has a peculiar way of teaching, sometimes through patience, other times through pain. And when the lesson comes through pain, it doesn't choose gentle words or convenient moments. It comes as an abrupt revelation, forcing you to face the truth you've avoided for so long. I look back at everything that happened and realize it wasn't just about an unfortunate comment, a humiliation, or exchanging attention for a dog. It was about years of small, silent choices that shaped an entire relationship. The hidden truth is that every gesture, every omission, every careless word builds or destroys the place we occupy in each other's hearts. And when we realize that place is disappearing, we have two options: accept it or transform it. I chose to transform it. I don't expect everyone to understand my decision. For many, it may seem extreme to have left like that, to have let the silence speak for me. But anyone who has experienced the feeling of becoming invisible knows there is no simple solution. It needed to make an impact. It needed to break the cycle that kept repeating itself. And to do that, I had to leave him, body and soul, so that he would feel, in an inescapable way, the weight of my absence. The curious thing is that this journey didn't just transform him. I changed too. I discovered that my voice doesn't depend on who hears me, and that my value isn't determined by how often someone calls me. The mindset that kept me stuck in the idea that staying is always the best choice was replaced by a new understanding. Sometimes, leaving is the only way to truly return, or, in some cases, to never return. Revisiting certain memories is like leafing through an old album. There are images that warm the heart, and others that weigh like a stone. I remember the boy who ran into my arms when he fell, the teenager who sought my approval even in small victories. And I wonder at what point affection was lost in the rush of adulthood. I don't know the exact answer, but I know it wasn't sudden, and that's what hurts the most, realizing that, while I believed I was secure in my role, the walls of that bond were being silently eroded. Today, when I repeat to myself that those who treat a mother like an animal will end up howling with longing. It's not just a catchphrase, it's a real reminder, built on experience and scars. It's a warning to anyone who still has the chance to choose how to treat those who raised them, because life, with all its limited patience, doesn't hesitate to reverse roles when necessary. And I don't say this with rancor, but with the clarity of someone who's seen what happens behind the scenes in relationships when gratitude disappears. It's like a house that's beautiful on the outside, but with its beams rotting one day, the weight becomes unbearable, and it collapses. The difference is that, unlike a house, relationships can be rebuilt, but this only happens with truth, sincere repentance, and, above all, a change in attitude. Therefore, for me, respect is not a luxury, it's a foundation. And those who understand this early avoid losing what, one day, may become irretrievable. If this story reminded you of someone you value or lost, write "I remember" in the comments. If you've made it this far, I think you've already realized that this space is more than stories, it's a place to reflect. Recognize yourself, and perhaps change something within yourself. If you want to continue being a part of this, subscribe to the channel. That way, you'll be notified whenever a new story airs, and our conversation won't be lost on. So I know you stuck with me until the end. Leave the phrase, "This message was for me," in the comments. It's simple, but it will be our way of recognizing ourselves among so many people. If this video resonated with you, please leave a like. It's not just a button, it's YouTube's way of understanding that this content can reach more people who need to hear something like this. And since you're here, there's a video right here that complements this topic. Click and continue with me there. The story isn't over yet,